Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Marcela Ot'alora. Marcela is a psychedelic psychotherapist and artist. She's worked as a therapist in the clinical trials for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which has been spearheaded by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. She recently served as the principal investigator for their Phase 2 and Phase 3 trials for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. She also trains and supervises the psychedelic psychotherapists of the future. Today we talk about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for trauma and what it can tell us about the nature of trauma. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Marcela Ot'alora. Marcela, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. So maybe we can just begin with how you first came across psychedelic psychotherapy.
I first came across it in 1984, and it was to do my own work to work with PTSD, and it was the first time, and it was I really realized its value. It helped me a lot during that time, and I was, I think, 23, and I just felt like, okay, this is something that should be available for other people who wanted and needed, because I hadn't seen anything quite like it before. And so it was I think it started a commitment for me to advocate for MDMA, to make it available to more people. And then, a year later, or a few months later, actually, like maybe 6 months later, was when it was placed on Schedule 1.
Right. So you first came across it when it was legal.
Right. It was still legal, but it was just maybe, not even a year later, it was when it was criminalized. So it was, I was reading about this, or I was thinking about this a couple of days ago, thinking it's been 35 years, since we've been working on this. And so it's been a long, long journey.
Right. And it must have been shocking to have undergone healing with this kind of method, and then for it to suddenly be criminalized in this heavy-handed way. I can't imagine. That must have seemed so irrational.
Yes. It was so devastating. And I made a commitment then to not only advocate for it, but go back to school. I went to school for literature and art, and I was an art teacher. And I wanted to go back to school so that I could really do therapy. I had been doing a lot of art with inner city kids populations. So really working with healing with art, and really felt like MDMA would be really great for that population to work with art. And so my wheels began to turn then, and I ended up going back to school so that I could study psychology, transpersonal psychology, and just be ready for when the day would come when maybe it would happen. And there were times when I really felt like it wasn't going to.
Right. And am I right that your first sessions were with Rick Doblin, who runs MAPS?
Yes.
Okay, and because he's really been pushing this forward, hasn't he?
Yes, he has been a believer for sure.
Yeah. And so I guess, was that part of the conversation even at the time, 3 decades ago, that there was some hope that in the distant future you could get this rescheduled and make it available for people?
Yes. I think that was always Rick's plan. He started MAPS in 1986, so a year later. And just his emphasis, his focus has been on that, has been on how do we move this forward, this journey of really understanding that healing can happen, and maybe not for everybody. I'm sure it's not for everybody, but definitely as an option, it should be available, because we have, even before the studies, we had so much anecdotal information, anecdotal stories of success stories of people who had gotten help with MDMA.
Right. And would you be able to briefly explain the studies that MAPS and you have been working on over recent years?
Yeah, so the first one that I worked on was in 1999 in Spain. So in Spain, it was the first government approved study. And so I moved to Spain. My family and I moved to Spain so that I could be a therapist in that study. But it got shut down because a lot of fear, a lot of erroneous information, bad publicity, and the government shut it down. So it was devastating, and there was another devastation of like, here's the first government approved study and it gets shut down. And so I moved back to the United States, and then in 2001 was when we started the process for the first study in the US, and the Myth Offers in South Carolina did that study. And I just kept waiting for mine, like, when am I going to be able to do this again? And then finally in 2012, then MAP started a phase 2 study in Boulder. And so I worked on that study until 2016 was when we finished our year of follow-ups. So now it's been a while. And then we started phase 3. We finished we have 2 phase 3 studies. We finished the first one a few months, like right when COVID hit. So that both studies were supposed to be 100 people, and we got permission for that first study to close after 90 people because of COVID. So there were a few people that didn't finish or couldn't get started because of COVID. And then we had a bit of a delay, and now we're starting to treat participants for the last phase of phase 3. And so I run that one in Boulder again, and we started maybe a few weeks ago. We've already started with treatments for that study. And that one, and those are for PTSD, working with a PTSD population.
So you were kind of mentioning these, you have phase 2 and phase 3, right? And so these are the kind of the hurdles you have to go through, I guess, right? Doing clinical trials to show that this is an effective treatment, right, for PTSD. And perhaps we could go into what the symptoms of PTSD are and the kind of changes you might expect to see in a successful treatment with MDMA.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, with PTSD, there are the symptoms that people talk about in general, right? The ones that you would see in the DSM, that you have hypervigilance and nightmares and flashbacks and sometimes dissociation. And so you can read about those, but I think it's really important to understand how it affects people's lives. That if you are, what does hypervigilance mean in a person's life, right? So hypervigilance can look like that you never get a rest, that either you're always going to be thinking that there's danger around the corner, but also that there's danger within yourself, that you're dangerous, that whatever you do, there's going to be the next moment, whatever happens, you might say the wrong thing, you might do the wrong thing. And in retrospect, you did the wrong thing, you said the wrong thing. It's going to come and create chaos and disaster in your life, right? So then there's this pervasive kind of river running constantly of threat. There's a threat constantly happening. So if you can imagine that, right, that there's no rest from that, and that because of that, there's no room for curiosity, for present moment experience, for growth, for even understanding just a relationship with another human being, to really being curious about them, because the mind is so busy trying to keep these threats away that you miss the moment. You miss, maybe you have little flashbacks of those moments, but then they become, oh no, here's the fear, right? And I, if I can give you an example that I think is just a perfect example of somebody in our phase 2 study. she was experiencing this. She was talking about the feelings that she was feeling, the things that she was sensing. And she said, I'm really scared because this is something I've never had before. And I don't know what's going on. And I'm really scared. And we were trying to work with her to support her and to understand a little bit where that fear was coming from and what that fear was. And it looked very different than the fear of going into the trauma. And she kept trying to describe it, but couldn't have words for it. And then finally, she just started talking about it in a way that was like, there's something else going on here. And at the end, realizing that what she was actually feeling was peace, that it was so foreign to her and so scary that there was space in her brain, that she felt relaxed, that she could feel her body. That was just so foreign that it created this fear until she realized, oh, this is what it is. And I've never felt it before.
And so the people you're dealing with, do they tend to be people who are suffering from PTSD as a result of a kind of acute trauma rather than chronic stress, like being in a war or sexual assault or car crash, these kinds of things?
Yeah, so in phase 2, it was for treatment resistant PTSD. So people had to have had at least 6 months of treatment with either medicine and therapy, or medicine alone, or therapy alone, and that they failed in those treatments. And phase 3, it's not like that. We don't have treatment resistant, but it is more complex PTSD. In general, the PTSD that can get some good results with other treatments can be more specific, like something happened like one time specifically. But when it's pervasive, it's very difficult, right? It's something that then becomes not only a trauma that happened and that affects you a lot and can be really harmful and damaging, but it becomes part of an identity. So there's an identity built up around it of, this is who I actually am. And there's this extraordinary part of us that is latent, that is like just not there because the identity becomes the coping strategies and the trauma itself. And so then you're dealing with not just an event that happened, but a way of being. And how do you work with this way of being that makes it so difficult to do with existing treatments, and that we have found good results with MDMA?
Right. And you mentioned it works for treatment resistant PTSD as well, right? So that's something, we're not just talking about another treatment here. There's a bunch of things you could use. PTSD is something that is often seen as, until MDMA came along, I remember learning that it was effectively untreatable. And then we're seeing really strong results, right? I mean, it's been designated a breakthrough, we give breakthrough status,
Yes.
right, as a treatment.
Yes. And with statistically significant results. There's the data, right? There's numbers, and we need that, and we need the research. And then there's the stories, the stories of people that, does it work for everybody? No. Are there some people in the studies that have not gotten particularly great results? Yes. And they still suffer from PTSD? Yes. But also at the same time, people report having healing happen, even if they still meet criteria for PTSD. Significant reduction in some of their symptoms. A lot of times people do not return to psychiatric medications. And to be in the study, you have to then taper off your psychiatric medications if you're on them. And for some people, they have been on them for a long time. For some people, they have been on several, like 5 medications and 5, 7, sometimes even more medications. And so tapering off those medications is, one, very challenging, very difficult, but also it creates, it reminds them of who they are with a variety of feelings, right? Like instead of just a few feelings, it's more, wow, this is really challenging to be off them, but now I can do the treatment. And then sometimes, often after the treatment, they don't go back to those medications, or they go back with a they take a lot less.
Right. And I mean, because a lot of the time people are prescribed antidepressants, right, SSRIs for PTSD as a kind of numbing, to have a kind of numbing effect on the symptoms. And I think what you just raised is really maybe a crucial difference between that approach and MDMA, where you're very much, I guess, allowing the traumas to come out, allowing the symptoms to manifest, and then kind of confronting them
Right.
and trying to kind of understand them.
Yes. So the treatment itself is the opposite of a lot of treatments that happen with in therapy, which is, I think, antidepressants can be very helpful for somebody. It can make the difference between not being able to function and being able to function. So there's definitely a value to them, and that keeping these feelings that being able to get up in the morning and being able to have a job and being able to do what you want to do is important. And this treatment is more addressing it, like really going into the feelings of the trauma, into the feelings of your the symptoms, what the symptoms have created, what your coping strategies, how your coping strategies have helped, but also how your coping strategies have kept you from the essence of who you are, because they have become who you are, and it's a sense of in a way a false identity, you know. So our treatment is about then addressing what's there, what comes up in the moment, what's there in that present moment, how, what you're feeling, sadness, fear, anger, happiness, joy, whatever it is, being able to really stay with it and work through it so that you're going through it instead of away from it. And so we teach more around, is it possible to stay with it, to stay with these feelings that maybe up to this point, when you got to this particular door, this particular, if we use a metaphor of a door, that's when I stop. That's when the danger is. I do not want to open that door, so I back off. And that's when all my coping strategies come into play, when I get close to that door. And with MDMA is, how can we help you open that door? How can we support you and be here for you so you can open that door? And MDMA, it's a great support for that. It's a great support for that, because it really brings in those other aspects of the self that have been latent, that have been kept hidden. And so there's a lot of support. It's resource rich, right? It's lots of resources that come from inside, that then they feel, oh, I can totally open this door.
Right. It's probably worth diving into the effects of MDMA, so people have a sense of why it's so helpful, gives those resources you mentioned. So, I guess it's often today included under the kind of umbrella term psychedelic, even though traditionally, it has very different effects to something like LSD, right? And I think people have sometimes called it empathogen or entactogen, because the effects are less kind of visionary and more to do with kind of, I guess, feeling connected and loving and compassionate and all of these kinds of qualities of openness. Is that a fair way to describe the effects subjectively?
Yes, I think it. I like to say that it's about a journey of intimacy with the self. You become very intimate with yourself and with everything that is there. And that the way this is achieved, if we think about, so it releases oxytocin, a sense of bonding, a sense of being connected, and oneness with the world, or oneness with other people, with yourself especially, right? That there is then a connection to self that happens. And serotonin, which creates a sense of well-being as well. Prolactin, that is relaxing. So there's all these elements that come together to then say, if you have a sense of well-being and a sense of connection and a sense of relaxation, but you're not numb to your feelings, and your fear is lessened. So there is a sense of deactivation in part of the amygdala, so your fear is not quite as activated. So you have less fear, but you still have full range of feelings, more feelings than you're used to. And then you have these resources here of like, I can address the trauma while feeling this, while still feeling in my body, while still feeling connected, while still feeling a sense of well-being. So then it just creates this balance then of, it's not all trauma, it's not all challenge and suffering. Even if I'm suffering, even if it's really painful what I'm dealing with, I'm still connected to a sense of myself that I never had before, or
Right.
didn't for a long time.
And you mentioned this that it reduces amygdala activity, part of the brain that processes fear. And I feel like um, several years ago I had therapeutic experiences with MDMA, and it felt very much like in everyday life there's like a kind of firewall around certain traumatic memories that are kind of too hot to go near, but the MDMA just kind of just lowered those boundaries so you can walk right up to the trauma, and suddenly it's there and you're reliving it, but you're still bathed in what feels like a very kind of positive mood, feels like a very kind of loving
Yes.
feeling, but it can still be huge. The traumas can still be overwhelming, but you're not hijacked in a way where you kind of viscerally have to reflexively shut it down and say, no way am I facing that. Instead, you can
Yes.
turn towards it.
Yes. I mean, I think you say a really important word of being hijacked, right? One of the things that happens with PTSD is that we get hijacked when the trigger happens. So it can be hijacked, and then all of a sudden I'm back in another place at another time and in different age where everything is dangerous, even though I know that I'm here today, right? So the hijacking can happen. And with MDMA, there's a natural way that parts work happens, like people describe parts of themselves, and sometimes even in a language that they've never used before, where they really address, there is a part of me that feels this, and there is a part of me that feels this. And so it creates enough space so there's a sense of objectivity, a sense of watching different parts come in and say, oh, there is this part of me that was this little girl that was really suffering, that was there and is here now. And then we can work with that part, but never kind of forgetting the witness or the part of the self that we call the inner healer. So in the modality that we use, we have a strong belief in the inner healing intelligence of every human being, that part shows up in MDMA and really guides the participant, that's the guide. It's not the therapist the guide, it's the inner healer who is the guide and who says, I know what I need and I can address and I can be present here even when there's these really scary parts.
Okay. And is that grounded in internal family systems as a kind of branch of psychology? It very much explores this idea of parts.
Well, I think internal family systems is a great tool to have because parts comes up. And I don't think it's absolutely necessary to be an internal family systems therapist in order to do this work. I
Right.
think what it takes is the awareness of parts of the self, the awareness and the respect that if there's a little girl in front of me, if I'm talking to a little part of you, then I want to address it as a little part of you, and I want to understand and make it safe and hold the boundaries that part in the participant needs. So there is an awareness that needs to happen about parts, but you don't have to be an internal family systems therapist in order to do this work. As a matter of fact, we encourage that therapists don't use language of any modality that they normally use, that they can use the resources and the skills that they come from it, but not necessarily the language, because we're not doing that work, right? We're not doing internal family systems work. We're not doing somatic experiencing, so
Right.
even
Yeah,
though
I
they're
think
both really important.
Yeah, I think so in my experience, it was very, as you said, it was very much the kind of natural homeostatic healing intelligence of the body that seemed to be playing out. And it was only after the fact that I came across internal family systems, somatic experiencing, and realized those point to truths that anyone can discover inside themselves, inside their own body and their own mind. And so, yeah, I completely agree. You don't need to get hung up on the jargon of one particular system, but if people, I
Yeah.
guess, want to follow up on if they're like, oh, what does it mean to experience trauma release in the body? These are, somatic experiencing is perhaps one place they could look, and same for parts of the
Yeah.
internal family systems.
So for you, was it that after the experience, then internal family systems then create a more of a context for what you had felt? Was it helpful in that way?
So I've actually not explored it very much. I mainly point to it just for people who are listening who want to, who feel that resonates. They might want to, my understanding is that's kind of explores this understanding of parts. But no, for me, I think I've had this ever since I've had an intuitive sense of these different parts of myself, and um, and yeah, have kind of followed my own kind of, I guess, my own kind of self-directed healing in that way. But so I don't, I'm not someone who's read books on IFS or anything like that, but I'm pointing out more for someone who has no idea, if you're living in a way where you haven't identified any of these parts within yourself, I guess that's just a body of literature that my understanding is explores it.
Yes. Yes. And I think it would be really helpful. There's many ways, there's different modalities for working with parts, and internal family system is one of them, and one of the ones that is very successful and works really well. So I think it's very helpful, and to have that understanding. And I do tell people, just explore it, read some about it, but also normalize it. That we all have the sense. I think every person that I know has said things to me like, well, there's a part of me that really wants to go to this party, but a part of me that doesn't want to go. I mean, we use it automatically, right? Like we've had it our whole lives. There is a part of me that enjoys company. There's a part of me that prefers solitude, and these parts kind of come out at different times, right? The parts of ourselves that show up, and then maybe we haven't quite thought about it in that language, but then it comes up. And we've had several participants who will say, I don't know why I'm talking like this. I never said this, like a part of myself. I'm not like, like, am I crazy? Or like they become a little bit like, oh, this is kind of strange. Like I've never thought about it this way. So it's actually a way of normalizing that it is the way we work internally, that if you really think about it, oh, there is a part of me, there is a part of me that does this and does that. And so that normalizing gives room for more exploration and more invitation about parts that maybe are unwelcomed too. It's pretty challenging to invite a part that is unwelcomed, but in our modality, we always say every single part is welcomed, no matter if you like them or not, if it's challenging or not. They're welcomed here. And how do we make it safe for them
And
to
you
come
mentioned,
forward and say what they need to say?
you mentioned that there's this part of, I can't remember the term you used, something like true self or higher self, from which you see the parts.
Yeah, like the witness, or
Okay.
the inner healing intelligence.
Right.
That
Yeah.
part that shows up, I think, very early on in the experience of MDMA, because we get out of our way, because our critic and our judge sort of take a step back, and the ones that have been guarding the door, the gate, right, they take a step back, and then the inner healer is able to come in and go like, wow, like I am a wise person that knows what I need.
Right. And I think that's a crucial point, that the reason an altered state is valuable is, we're usually going around just kind of operating reflexively, feeling like an integrated single person. But then in this kind of altered state, suddenly there's this kind of very inclusive, accepting quality to the MDMA of kind of allowing everything, not being hijacked by shame or wanting to kind of reject parts of yourself. And then in this kind of spaciousness of just, you have the kind of awareness of your mind, of consciousness, and then within it, there are parts arising, reactions, and then you can suddenly, so for me, to give an example, there's, from having to kind of grow up too quickly, there's kind of parts that are kind of toddler-like, that are like, have been rejected. And so it almost became like, almost hearing a voice in my head of a toddler having a tantrum. And in normal consciousness, that sounds like an odd thing to say and not something you'd want to kind of own. And so you say, so just unconsciously, you're like, that's a part that I reject. But then suddenly being able to kind of lovingly see it and go, okay, there is some part of me that doesn't want to be the grown up, doesn't want to just get on with life. There's some part of me that wants to have a strong reaction. And then if you can just kind of see that in awareness, then suddenly it's like, okay, and then it has its reaction and then you move on, right? And instead of people being kind of unconsciously hijacked, as we said before, by these things that are going on under the surface.
Yeah, exactly. And in the exploration of it, we realize what those parts hold and also what they protect us from. That we do have parts, if we're talking about like internal family systems theory, we do have parts that then have jobs and hold this particular, I need to protect you from this feeling. So this is the way I protect you, right? I throw a temper tantrum, I protect you, or I do this, or I withdraw, or I close doors. So in the exploration, when we don't reject them and do accept them and we do invite them in, then we understand them. So instead of them being one-dimensional, they become three-dimensional. They become an actual part of ourselves. And it's like, it's a part that holds all these different things, that holds fear, or that holds this, that maybe younger part has always held the fear, and so, or the pain. And so we say, I want to go to there because that part just holds pain. It's just pain. But once you look at it, it holds more than pain, right? There is then the discovery of creativity of other parts, that maybe that part also holds this amazing creativity or amazing imagination that we have also warded off, that in our attempt to not look at the painful part, we have also warded off and prevented us from enjoying our own resource of other parts of ourselves that are very creative, right? So I don't believe that one part holds just one thing. And if it becomes three-dimensional and it becomes more of a person, then we understand those other parts too. It's more complex. It's more complex than just one-dimensional.
And you kind of pointed to, again, the idea that you can discover that the kind of trauma response can actually, rather than being people going and feeling they're broken in some way, they have some disorder, they can actually see that these are kind of quite wise coping mechanisms, and be quite thankful to those coping responses.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's part of the healing. It's so beautiful when somebody can say, wow, like this part that I've hated, it's just protected me all this time. And I'm so thankful for it. It's so painful, right? It's so painful sometimes to see that how mean we can be to parts of ourselves and how devastating that it can be. And I think part of the think about the pain that can happen in this process, it's not just pain coming from the trauma and coming from the feelings of the trauma, but also from the way we've kept ourselves from living a life that we've wanted. And that can be so sad and devastating too. And then also so exciting, right? Like now I get to be curious. I get to, for myself, I think one of the biggest healings for me was that I became curious of other people. I had room for exploration of sensations and of being in connection to people, and had curiosity about people's states, so it was like it was a shift from, oh, the only time that I could do school, like people say, well, how could you go to school? How could you go to college? How could you do all these things? It's like, you can do those things. You can use your mind and cognitively, right? And stop curiosity of another kind. And so you're just being able to study, to learn, to know, to read. All those parts can be very active. And then there's this part that is like a child, has never been able to develop that sense of curiosity.
Right. And you mentioned early on this kind of distinction between PTSD that comes from a kind of single acute overwhelming event versus what might be called complex PTSD, or, during development, if you're living in a kind of chronically stressful situation, your way of being becomes kind of traumatized in some way. And I feel like the things we're talking about seem to apply very well maybe to the complex PTSD. I'm sure they also apply to the acute case. But do you think this
Yes,
these
absolutely.
tools allow people to come out of that way of being?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful for definitely for treatment resistant. And, I'm not saying that I don't believe that just one event cannot cause the same kind of identity, right? Like, it just depends on how long we've lived with it, and how our coping strategies are, and what even came before it, right? Like, I think it's not in isolation. It's like, if we were raised in this particular way where everything was very safe, and there was a sense of self-worth and love and compassion, then it's going to be easier to deal with maybe trauma that happens, right? And so it's how do we, what is it that is affecting us? What is the trauma affecting? And so that is, I think, more important. And so, yes, complex PTSD, because it's more difficult to treat, but that the most important part is, what are all the systems that happened? What are the conditions that happened to get us to the particular place that we're in? And it could have been just one particular trauma that led us there, but because of all the circumstances on our lives around us. So it's more, I think, that identity that we have, that identity that can be so difficult to shift, because it's also, many times we've had participants that will say, oh, wow, like, as they begin to shift and healing begins to happen, they'll say, who am I without PTSD? I have no idea who I am without PTSD. And that is really scary. It's very scary to not know all of a sudden, and to say, oh, my coping strategies don't work anymore, or I don't want them because of the price tag attached to them. And who am I now? And how do I function in the world? And I think it's that's the work that happens after. That's the work that we continue to do after the treatment of, how do I integrate this into my life? And how do I give myself time to discover who I am and discover how I want to be in the world without PTSD?
Right. And you kind of touched on this, I guess, idea that in the healing, you're going from feeling fundamentally unsafe in the world to feeling safe, and I guess in you're kind of offering a kind of safe container when you're as a therapist, right? And people need to move from, I guess if we take a simple example of acute trauma, if it's someone who's been in a war and there's a single event, like a bomb goes off and they are having flashbacks, I think maybe people can understand part of the healing mechanism as being, if it's 5 years later and you're back home, there's no risk of a bomb going off, but you're still hijacked by this fear. And then suddenly you're in a safe room, you're back with, you're with your family and your normal life, but then you're in a safe room with therapists, you have the MDMA in your system. And then you can just have a new perspective shift, I think, where suddenly you just get it, that you're safe. You just suddenly realize, you update that memory, and you realize that you were in a safe room with people who are looking after you. You're no longer in that environment. And I mean, MDMA also reopens plasticity in the brain, right? So it seems that you can just basically update the memory to the memory of safety.
Yeah, that you can have both, reconsolidation of memory, right? That then the memory gets opened up and these other parts are added to it, which is, oh, I'm here safe. I just recalled this trauma. Sometimes, I don't think it happens all the time, but sometimes we've had people who will recall the trauma, and so it's kind of like exposure therapy, but
Mm.
it's naturally occurring, so that they start talking about all the events that led up to it and the events of the trauma and like the incident, and in a way that that their body doesn't stop them, so that they can continue to do that in a way that feels safe. Sometimes they'll say, wow, like I'm indulging myself in going this process of memory, even though it seems like that would be harmful, that it's an indulgence because I can do it without hyperactivation, without numbing. I can actually recall and understand what happened, and that part of the healing happens from that, right? From that, from being able to tell the story uninterrupted by the body that tries to stop it, to protect it.
And you mentioned that you're kind of allowing the person themselves, their natural healing intelligence, to direct the process. How would you describe your role in this process?
Mm-hmm. Um, I think part of it is we do want to make room for everybody's style. We all have a different style, a different way of approaching things, so that there's room for that. But mostly that I am not the expert, that I actually don't know. And so for me, myself, if I'm talking about a personal experience, my biggest challenge in a session is having an agenda, having the part of myself that thinks I know because I've treated trauma for a long time, because I'm a therapist that has worked with this. And so because I know, right, there's a part of me that thinks and feels that it knows, like it knows what's going on for you right now, and I want to help you. And so is, how do I get that part out of the way and come back to the present moment and say, maybe that's true. Maybe there's a truth in that. Maybe what's happening for this person is what I'm thinking is happening, but there's also something happening that I couldn't possibly imagine in a million years. I would not be able to imagine really what's happening, because ultimately, when they come up with the solutions that they come up with for their lives, it's something they never imagined. It feels so foreign to me. I go, wow, that is unbelievable. I never thought of that. So, as a therapist, it's more, how do we allow room for that, for the exploration that they're having of, how do I sit with them? They're figuring it out for themselves. And so I can help them, I can ask questions, I can be curious, but I can also suspend my agenda of what I think needs to happen or what I think it's true, so that I can make room for what actually their inner healing intelligence is trying to tell them.
Right. And I think you're absolutely right to emphasize this kind of natural healing intelligence that happens. But I think with MDMA more than any other substance, I really think that the kind of healing container that you offer is really valuable, because so my first experience was, it was self-directed, and unlike other substances, like, people go on ayahuasca retreats and people find healing with mushrooms and things, these kind of naturally occurring things, I think, things can unfold in a way that can be self-directed. With MDMA, maybe because it's synthetic, it seems to be so powerful. In my case, the recall of events was too much too soon. And if I'd been in a therapeutic context, I'm sure I would have had a guide who would say, okay, like, step back for a second. But so that's perhaps one of my few missteps of kind of exploring this space for myself. So I think that's something to emphasize for people. While there are lots of people experimenting with other psychedelic substances for healing by themselves, I think MDMA is one to particularly emphasize the value of having a safe therapeutic container.
That's great. And so you were able to do that. You were able to do both, like realize that. that first
Yeah, I
experience?
mean, for me, it ended up being very valuable because I think without it allowed me to, I went, I went from thinking I had depression to realizing it was secondary to trauma, and then thinking I could kind of go into the trauma and release it, which did happen, but it just led to, it was too much too soon, and I felt kind of dissociated for a while and overwhelmed by it. But that then gave me a huge amount of material to work with, and so it ended up for the best. It ended up being incredibly therapeutic, but I don't think I don't think a therapist would have guided me the way I ended up going. I think they would have taken a wiser, slower approach.
Mm,
Yeah, it can work out for the best, but I think MDMA is something that's very powerful.
yeah, yeah. I had actually a similar experience of the first time doing it by
Really.
myself. So I understand what you're saying. And I think you bring up a really important point, which is too fast, too soon. That part of this work is both, yes, if that's going to happen, having a container where there's going to be therapists there that are going to be able to hold what you're experiencing, right? That as a therapist, the training is really, can you hold what's going to happen in the room, what's going to come in the room, which could be really difficult and challenging. Can you hold that? And I think we can hold it if we step out of the way and we engage, we sort of dive into their world and really support them in that. And so I'm not important there, right? Like whatever I say, whatever I do, it's not so important as it is for me to hold that container. So that's really important in order as a guidance, right, of helping somebody with titrate or even point out like what's happening to you right now. Is this too much? Okay, it's too much. Let's stay with that it's too much. What is that, right? Like that those are the kinds of things that maybe a person doing it on their own might not be able to do. But the other piece that is important around it is that because shifts happen too fast or very fast, it's a great thing. And that's one of the good things about MDMA that we say, oh, people always say, this is amazing. It's just like a lot happened, right? And at the same time, when a lot happens fast, then you have to catch up. And there's a period of catching up. And so the integration of the experience is just as important because it is the catching up to yourself of like this big change. What do I do with that now? And if we're left alone and we don't have the therapy and we don't have the integration, that that can, that can be left also untouched. And then there's no integration because it was just too fast, too soon, like you said. And so the integration part of this work is just as important. It's very, very crucial for what can continue the growth that can continue to happen in life.
Yeah, I definitely feel like it unlocked material that then was healed through the integration process. As you say, that was where the real
Yes.
kind of healing work happened.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
yeah, it's strange to have this kind of to simultaneously feel like it was a slight misstep, but also had incredibly beneficial results, because without that huge unearthing of material, perhaps I would still be struggling with those problems that now have disappeared. And
Mm-hmm.
fortunately, over coming years, hopefully people won't be faced with with these kinds of problems, because it will hopefully be prescribable, legally available as a therapy. And so that's currently on track over the next few years. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're hoping that this is the last phase 3 study, and we're treating 100 people over 15 sites. So I'm thinking maybe 2 years, 18 months or so. So right now, the projected date is 2023 that we can apply for MDMA to become a prescription medication for PTSD in conjunction with therapy. So using this same modality and continuing in this next few years to train therapists to work with this modality and to be able to offer this kind of treatment post approval.
And if someone's interested in becoming a psychedelic psychotherapist, what are the kind of main routes people might take to that?
hmm So they can apply for trainings that are happening. Like right now we're working with our training program and expanding our training program. And so MAPS will post when the next trainings are in Europe and the US, in other, hopefully other parts of the world too. And then people can apply for those trainings. And the trainings just have different parts to it. So, and right now we're doing starting, just a few months ago, we started doing trainings online because of COVID. And so we've done a few online that have worked well, it's definitely not my preference, but they have worked and people have done a good job. And then there's that last part, which is then people need to wait post approval to be able to work with a patient, work with a client, and get supervision on it so that we really understand that they know the modality that they're following and that they're keeping people especially safe, right? That we want people to be safe and to be able to feel that trust has been built and that there's preparatory work and there's integration work happening in addition to the MDMA.
Right. And if we turn to something a kind of zoomed out issue to end on, I feel like it's not a coincidence that MDMA produces these kinds of loving, connected feelings, and in so many different wisdom traditions, you have this emphasis on love, the kind of redemptive healing power of love, as a kind of a stance, I guess, of openness and inclusiveness. And so, to me, it feels like we're dealing here with a kind of, I guess, science showing the wisdom and the kind of physiological truth of those teachings of the kind of foundational importance of love.
Oh, absolutely. And that if it starts with, I get so many people say, like, I sometimes it feels so corny, right? Like that we say, well, it's about love, but it's the truth. It's actually is the truth. And part of it is the beginning of loving yourself. If we think about another symptom of PTSD, oftentimes is not loving yourself. There is a sense of there's something profoundly wrong with me and I'm not a lovable person. And the beginning of that, of being able to love yourself and being able to be connected to that love of you, then expands into love for others and love for the planet and love for your fellow man, right? Your fellow human beings. And so how do we, it's a great place to start, right? It's a great place to start. And it is corny to say, oh, you need to love yourself first. But the truth is that when you do, then you do know your connection to other. When you connect to yourself, then you do understand your connection and your respect and your honoring of another human being and their inner healing intelligence and their wisdom and their specialness, right? Their power, their extraordinary self.
And I think MDMA in particular and altered states in general have this amazing quality of, right now, the parts of our minds that want, are aware of the corniness of talking about love in this way are very much online. But then in these states, they can be, whatever that defensive part for a lot of people that comes up when they want to reject ideas of love, that can be taken offline. And suddenly you're just there in feeling humbled by this huge, experience of these experiences can be utterly, beyond words in terms of how big they feel in terms of, these feelings of opening to love. And so I think it's just nice to kind of point to the fact that we can talk about these experiences now with words, and love feels like the best word we can use, but it points to something truly transformative, things that can free people from, suicide inducing conditions like PTSD. And we're talking about something very profound and very real, I guess.
Yes, we are. And that it's not going to be for everybody and that it's not a magic bullet, right? That there's a lot of work that needs to happen afterwards, right? And a lot of integration, a lot of understanding of the self. But it is a promising treatment.
Yeah.
So that's also very important.
Yeah, I absolutely can't wait until it's rescheduled, and I really value the work that you've been doing and for taking the time to speak to me. Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you.
Is there anywhere you would send people if they want to look up your work any further?
They can find it through maps. They can find some of the work that we've been doing. The paper for our phase 2 study that happened in Boulder is in MAPS. So MAPS has a big library of different parts, and I'm doing the study in Boulder. So hopefully we can move forward with that without delays and can just continue this work, and then a couple of years from now be able to offer it and have our clinics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of you once this revolutionizes mental health care in coming years. So look forward to that.
I hope so.
Yeah. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.